For those streaming, you might not have been able to see that, but that was an amazing sizzle reel. Thank you, Guy. So kicking off today, if we've done our job correctly, you will leave this room inspired and informed. And our first speaker, Johanna, she has been on our screen for more than 3 decades. It's hard to believe. We've had a tough year. We've had a year of redundancies, we've had a year of tough economical climates, we've had tightening of budgets, we've had campaigns that start and stop. And Johanna's going to draw upon her experience of resilience, goal setting, and overcoming adversity to achieve what she's achieved today. So prior to her 3 decades on TV, she was also representing Australia in the pool. She survived our industry for that long, which means she's got a story or two. And we welcome her to the stage from the Seven Network, Johanna Griggs. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I too would like to thank the Gadigal people for having me on their lands, pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who join us either in the room or the live streaming, and acknowledge your deep connection to the land, the air, the seas and the waterways that surround us. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm actually really thrilled to be able to speak to you all. I mean, there's nothing like starting a conference with somebody talking about their incredibly vacuous life. I have been asked to tell you about my experiences in media, and I guess the things that I've learned over the past 33 years. So if I'm being honest, my main goal of today's presentation is that I don't put you all to sleep. Away from my day job, where I have been described over the years as a warm prop, a talking meat puppet, or a moving foreground with a pulse, I actually do lead a very full and busy life. My husband Todd and I currently split our lives between the Northern Beaches in Sydney and the Lower Hunter Valley. We run a construction company, and we have just started building our forever home in the bush. On our farm we have bees, dogs, cattle. Actually, Todd and I have done an artificial insemination course, so when I say that we're hands-on with our cattle, you can take that any way you like. But to balance it out, we've also done a beginner's butchery course. We are very practical. I grow about 85% of all my veggies. I pickle them, I preserve them, I freeze them, I dehydrate them, and I give away all of the excess. Todd says that I am the woman with 1,000 hobbies, but to be honest, it's one of the perks of my TV job, as I get exposed to so many passionate and brilliant people that I end up trying all sorts of things. And my justification is for it that I'm constantly learning. And they say that if you develop a passion for learning, that you never cease to grow, and I really like that. But it also gives me a great balance to my life, as my hobbies keep me very grounded and happy, and many of them are very meditative. Despite the introduction, I'm not actually sure how many of you actually remembered that when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was actually a swimmer. I wasn't a great one, but I was a pretty solid swimmer, and I say that not to be faux humble, because I'm actually proud of everything that I achieved in the pool. But in the era that I swam in, it was such a golden one for Australian swimming. We had such an incredible depth of talent that I would honestly definitely rank myself well down the list of the greats. That said, I medalled at the Commonwealth Games, I medalled at the World Championships, and I was #1 in the world on 4 different occasions, so I wasn't a slouch by any means. It was just that I was swimming in an era where those things didn't even rank in the top 20 of the elites, and I'm fine with that. My swimming experience was a little unusual compared to a lot of my peers. Unlike a lot of them who actually swam very intensely from a young age, I had a real childhood, and it wasn't until I was talent spotted at a carnival that my mum was asked if I could actually step up my training from 2 sessions a week. As soon as I did, the next year I made my first New South Wales team, and then immediately onto the Australian squad after that. Before I knew it, I was training 11 sessions a week with loads of cross-training around those pool sessions. And from being on that very first Australian team that ventured into China in 1989, I was virtually on a plane or based overseas for periods of time from that point onwards. I swam in what I considered was the crossover era in the sport, from the very bad old days of the sport to what has transformed into a much more professional sport like we see today. The changes in my time in swimming were significant, but they were also significantly overdue. There actually was a lot that wasn't really great about it back then. In fact, a lot that was tolerated back then wouldn't actually pass any sort of test these days, no matter how you wrapped it up. But overall, the sport was good to me personally, great even. I love the social aspect of it, I love the travel, and I love the competition. But the overtraining, which was rife back then, I mean, I was a 50 and 100 metre backstroker and I did the same amount of training that the marathon swimmers did, and all of that travel did eventually catch up with me. A few weeks after winning that silver medal at the Worlds, I had my first proper break since I'd really ramped up my training, and I actually got sicker the more I rested than better. I couldn't bounce back. I was exhausted and fatigued beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. I'd previously had a couple of bouts of glandular fever, but this was like that on steroids. My system started to shut down and I ended up in hospital in a pretty bad way. I had a zillion tests done, I saw endless doctors, but still I wasn't getting better. I eventually got diagnosed after a long time with CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, which back then was akin to being diagnosed with leprosy. No one knew what it was, and there wasn't a quick fix for it. In many ways, it's still the same today in terms of what treatments work for one person don't necessarily work for another. And back then, there was a lot of scepticism and a lot of misinformation about the illness, whereas thankfully these days, there's a lot more credible information and support available. I tried a lot of complementary medicine along with conventional medicine to recover. I felt like I would go 2 steps forward and then 8 steps back. I had 2.5 years on a wheat-free, yeast-free, egg-free, corn-free, malt-free, sugar-free, beef-free, dairy-free, herb-free, spice-free, caffeine-free diet. And even then I was only allowed to eat certain foods with other foods at a time, so I had to be particularly careful about acidic foods. I'd take a huge amount of vitamins, up to 30 a day, every single day. On top of that, I'd have regular intravenous vitamin boosters and injections. I slept with a heart rate monitor on to gauge what stress my body was under internally. So when I'd wake, my resting heart rate would determine how much I'd be able to put my body through during the next day. It was very handy when I actually got back in the pool, because if my heart rate was too high, we knew I'd have to back off and actually rest for the day. But if it was okay, I'd be able to get up and get on with my day. Basically, I swapped the amount of hours that I used to spend training into seeing every doctor and specialist that I could to get back to full health. But even now, with the lens of more than half a lifetime of reflection and 1,000 learning experiences since that time, it is actually the single period of my life that I am most grateful for. It's the period where I learnt more about myself than in any other stage I can think of. I learned that I was a lot stronger and more determined and focused than most people gave me credit for. I also, through that period, I think I learnt the most valuable lesson of all about human nature, the good and the bad that comes with it. All of which I think has actually shaped me into the person that I am today, and probably, if I'm being honest, the work that I undertake and how I choose to undertake it. You see, I'd been one of the few athletes back then that was actually making quite a good living from sponsors. Within a few months of falling ill, once it became clear that it wasn't going to be a quick fix, I lost every single one of those sponsors almost immediately. After the first flush of friends who came to visit, once there wasn't an instant recovery, the visits became less and less frequent. By the end of that year, I only really had a couple of friends who stayed in semi-regular contact. Now, it wasn't because they or anyone else didn't want to come along. What I learned back then, that people, as a general rule, stay away from situations where they're unsure of what to say. And rather than say something wrong, and they worry that they'll say the wrong thing and never be able to recover from it, they just avoid the situation altogether. It's something I've just learned to accept is human nature. Ironically, it's actually the opposite of how we should react in situations that we find confronting or uncomfortable. But again, just knowing this has actually helped me countless times in my life since then. But the other reason I'm grateful for that period is, unlike a lot of athletes who actually only see their personal validation of themselves as athletes and what they achieved in sport, by having that actually taken away from me quite suddenly at an age where you should feel bulletproof. I mean, I was 17 when I first fell ill. I had to learn to get very comfortable with just being me and not just seeing myself as only an athlete. Also, when you're extremely unwell, you have to learn to live with and actually like who you are. You've got to be very comfortable in your own skin, because you actually have a lot of hours alone. You have to ask yourself a lot of hard questions. You have to be honest with yourself about whether every single thing that you actually can control in your day has been the very best of what you can do. And you also learn that not every day is going to be better than the day before, that some days are just going to not feel great. I say to everyone who I meet in life when they're being hypercritical of those around them, which, let's face it, is most people at one stage or another, that it's very easy to judge people on face value, but to keep in mind that you never actually really know what's going on in their personal life. And in all my walks of life, I am yet to meet a perfect person, and nor am I perfect. Often when I read articles on my life, or I hear people intro me, say that my swimming career was cut short because of that illness. It actually wasn't. It was interrupted. I actually went back into the pool twice. The first time I ended up swimming a meet when every indication from the heart monitor and all the tests that we were doing was that internally my body was battling something. But I had a dilemma. During my time out, they changed the backstroke turns. So you used to, time your strokes, count your strokes into the wall, touch a wall, flick your legs around and off you push. Well, now these days you'll see backstrokers get to the T-bar in the pool, they turn onto their stomach and they do a more traditional freestyle turn. So I had this dilemma, do I actually go back into the pool and get some race practice with the new turns, knowing that I was putting everything at risk, or do I actually stay out of the pool? I weighed it up and chose not to listen to my body. I swam at a meet in Canberra, and a week later I was back in hospital with pleurisy, which promptly turned into pneumonia. So in that instance, the risk didn't pay off that time, and as a result, I had to withdraw from the Olympic trials. It was a big story back in the day. There were a lot of people who were fighting on my behalf for me, saying that we should change the way that the Australian swim team was selected and the way the trials were conducted at that time. But personally, I had absolutely no issue with it, because as a swimmer, you actually know the rules, you know your boundaries. So it was very strange that I had all these people conducting a battle on my behalf that I hadn't asked for. And I'd already accepted that I was unable to be part of the 92 Olympics. If I wasn't at the trials, that was never going to happen in any capacity. So therefore, I had to give up my dream of making those games. But I also think it's the stage of my life where I learnt something else, which I still really believe in to this day. For me, the way that people lose and the way that they handle disappointment is way more telling and way more interesting to me than how they handle when everything's going well and when they're winning all the time. So I took 6 months off. I didn't even look at a pool. I actually took up a contract with Vivian's modelling agency, and I had the time of my life. But there was a niggle in the back of my mind, the question that played over and over again whenever I was alone. Could I get back to being the best if I did absolutely everything right? I wanted to know if I didn't take any risks, no matter how tempting it was, if I stayed on that incredibly restrictive diet without ever breaking it even slightly, and if I stuck to my sleep and treatment plans. And anyone who's ever gone through a rough patch knows that your sleep and your recovery is as important as anything else that you do. But if I did all of those things right, could I do it? Could I actually get back to my best? I spoke to my coach and we decided that we'd change the way that we swam and approached the sport. We'd do less hours of training, but more sprint-specific training, a little bit like Cam McAvoy, who was one of the great stories of the last Olympics. We came up with a drastically different program for me. The doctors at the time weren't all that supportive. They felt that I should just give my body a solid break for the rest of its life. But because I wasn't doing it for any other reason than to prove to myself that it was possible, we embarked on another return to the pool, and it was successful. In early '93, I hit the wall at the World Championship trials, having swum the fastest time in the world that year. Now that sounds way more impressive than it actually is, because it was only March after all. But the reaction that I got from the crowd that day, from Australian swimming, from the officials, from my peers, was quite extraordinary. I think most people knew what I had gone through to get back to that point, and they all thought that I was actually back for good. Whereas my coach and I, we knew differently. I knew the second that I touched that wall and saw that scoreboard that that was it, that I was 100% done and that I didn't want to live like that anymore. So at the ripe old age of 19, I announced my retirement. And yes, I can confirm it's quite wonderful if you're number one in the world and you announce your retirement. It feels great for a second. I remember ringing my mum that night to have a conversation with her and telling her I was going to retire, and I reflect on it. Her voice was just several octaves higher than it normally would be. She was very supportive, saying all the right things, but now I understand how worried for me she was. Because another thing from our era, during that time, we used to constantly travel to the other side of the world. It was like the Australians, we had a massive chip on our shoulder. We had to be in the thick of it. We had to be on the other side of the world the whole time, whereas these days, everyone travels out from all parts of the world to be with our incredible swimmers and our magnificent coaches. But back then, it was the opposite. And as a result, I'd had very little secondary education at all. So now, as a mother and a grandmother myself, I can completely understand why my mum was more than a little nervous for me. I remember when she asked me what I would do, I said, yeah, I might give working in media a bit of a crack. Now, obviously, I didn't know then what I do now and what every single person who is watching this presentation knows, and that is that any man, any woman, any person who competes in any type of sport has that same dream. And sadly, for most of them, that dream doesn't eventuate. And certainly even if they get an initial break, very few get to enjoy the longevity and the diversity of the career I've experienced since then. So I announced my retirement, and amazingly, the very next day after that announcement, I had 3 network contract offers from 7, 9 and 10. So I'd obviously been doing something right in the lead up. Or, as it so often happens in media, it probably just came down to incredible good luck with timing and the people that were in charge at that very moment. I went and spoke to all of the networks, and I decided to join the 7 network way back then because they promised me training, and I had enough of an ego that I didn't want to be totally diabolical on air. I learnt the first rule of television is that they will literally say anything to get you to sign on the dotted line, but they actually will lie through their teeth because I never got the training that they promised me I would. Instead, I was thrown on air in a range of different areas. They were all in sports. I was working on Sports World, in sports news, and hosting major sporting events. And diabolical, I was the definition of diabolical on air. I'm certain that there are still many people who think I am still diabolical, but I have definitely learnt to believe in my strengths and skill sets a lot more these days. And I know, even for those people that do feel like that, thankfully they always have a choice in what they're going to be watching, so it's no skin on off my nose, and they don't actually impact my personal life in any way. But when I think back to those early days, I pretty much learnt through public humiliation. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not ideal. I definitely wouldn't recommend it in these times of social media, having that in full force, but it's not entirely a bad way to learn, because if you had to search for a positive in learning through public humiliation, I promise you'll make a lot of mistakes once, but very few of them twice. One thing that I always try to do in media now, because of my experience with starting out, is try to mentor new people who are starting their journey. Now, 33 years on, it kind of blows my mind that it is still the one thing that actually rarely happens within our industry. Believe me, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your background is. Every single person, when they're thrown in the deep end or thrown completely out of their comfort zone, is going to have a whole catalogue of idiosyncrasies that they aren't even aware of. And it amazes me if you just take the time to sit with them, to show them the habits that they don't even realise they have, and share with them ways to actually get around them, how you can make that transition for them so much easier. I'm proud of a lot of things that I achieved in my time in media. I was the youngest ever female sports news reader in Sydney. After the first few years, I was sacked. They say you haven't made it in this industry until you have been sacked. But then I signed the first ever pay TV and commercial combined contract. So I actually worked for Foxtel. Back in the days when the 300th house or the 500th house would connect to Foxtel, we'd actually go and do a live broadcast from that person's home. And I even did the opening of Fox Studios, I thought, when I came back here today. But I was still allowed to work on a zillion different programs on commercial TV as long as I was introduced as Foxtel's own Johanna Griggs, because it actually gave promotion to Foxtel during that period. I've hosted, not reported or commentated on, hosted more Olympics and Paralympics on TV than any other male or female in the country. 8 Olympics and 3 Paralympic Games. And in 2002, I became the first female solo host of any Olympic Games coverage in this country, something that I've gone on to do at 6 out of the 8 games I've covered. I've hosted 17 years of the Australian Open and the Summer of Tennis and numerous other sporting events. And 6 out of the 9 years that I got to work on Sports World, which back in the day was an absolute institution, I was lucky enough to initially report, then co-host, and then I finally got to host the show by myself. And the fact that I talk about hosting these events and shows as opposed to working as a commentator or a reporter is a really big point of difference. Initially, as a female, I was offered things like I could do the weather update, I could do a sideline report, or I could do an injury update. And whilst I'm certainly not trying to degrade anyone who does those jobs these days, there is a plethora of people who do that absolutely brilliantly. Back then, I just refused to do it because I knew if I started that, I'd forever be pigeonholed into doing those roles forever. And I actually didn't want to. I wanted to break the mould a little bit. I knew I had a phenomenal memory. I knew that I loved doing the research, something that was drilled into me by Bruce McAvaney in my early days. It was going to be the greatest gift that I could give myself. And I knew that I was prepared to work hard. And I honestly believed if I could be given the opportunity, I felt like I would be able to eventually be as good as my male peers and counterparts who were previously pretty much the only hosts and definitely the only solo host of those type of events. That's why it was so important to me to be given a chance to prove myself. Having said that, it did take me a while to get there. I remember so many times in those excruciating early days just going into my bosses and saying to them, sit with me, tell me what I'm doing right, tell me what I'm doing wrong, tell me how I can actually get better. And they would just laugh. They thought it was so hilarious. They'd say, no, it's so funny watching you just bumble your way through it. Having been an athlete, I didn't actually understand that all that much. You know, I'd had a coach whose sole job was to stand on the side of the pool, pick out what was working, tell you what to keep improving on, but also how to leave behind all the things that weren't working. And there's great lessons in that. It teaches you how to carry the positives forward in your life and leave the negatives in your wake. And I couldn't understand why we couldn't do that same thing with presenting. So apart from the major sports event and sports shows, I've been lucky enough to host lots of various primetime lifestyle shows, such as Auction Squad, House Calls to the Rescue, Australia's Best Architecture, and Better Homes and Gardens. And I'm really proud of Better Homes and Gardens. This year is our 31st year on air, our 32nd season, and my 21st year as host. It is a program I adore because it's got 90 minutes of just incredibly positive stories that go to air each week. It celebrates great ideas, it gives inspiration and a voice to people and small businesses who are passionate about what they're doing. We have a seriously wonderful on-camera team and an even better off-camera team. We've got great leadership. My EP Russell Palmer's here, our series producer Rani Eaton, and leadership 100% comes from the top. We actually don't have one person who works on the show who doesn't genuinely love it and absolutely believe in it. And I think that is something that transcends through the screen and that people can really get a sense of that for themselves. I had one stint in reality TV on a show called House Rules. In the early days, I loved it before the direction of the show changed and it moved away from what I believe was everything that was good about it. I'd get to the end of those long ladder seasons with so many suggestions on ways that we could do things differently, on ways that we could be more efficient and save money. And I think that's what really gets my goat with reality TV. It's just the wasted time and money and inefficiency and the lack of background checks. But each year I'd be told, oh, look, thank you, that's so great, but your talent. Why would we listen to you? I remember being called into a meeting when I'd indicated to the bosses that I was leaving after 7 years, that I wanted to step away from the show, because I just realised I was wasting my time and that no suggestion I was ever going to make was going to be taken up. And I sat in this meeting and I was told the drama was going to be ramped up and the relationship angles and the contestants was going to be ramped up even more. And the executive who was laying it out to me said, and I believe that you think you have too much integrity to host the show with the direction it's going in this season. I remember bursting out laughing and saying to him, oh yeah, you're right, because to be honest, I'd rather stick needles in my eyes than actually do it like this. However, congratulations, that's actually the first time I've ever heard integrity be used as an insult. Needless to say, the audience didn't actually embrace the more dramatic, controversial format that following season. I do find it strange, the attitude sometimes within our industry to somebody who is on camera. If I could change one thing, it would probably be to create better pathways so that when you reach the stage that I'm at in my career, that you have someone with all that knowledge who's worked in every genre of the industry, who's watched and learned every step along the way, that there maybe could be opportunities that don't necessarily have to be on camera but could be opened up. And I remain outspoken on reality TV based on my experience and the experience of many of the contestants that I actually work closely with and advocated for. And every time I'm told by people who work in telly that it needs to be more nasty and more dramatic to work, I happily remind them of a beautiful program on a Friday night that just swims against the tide. And then, when we're on the main channel around all our sports commitments, it's a show that absolutely punches well above its weight. I've now actually worked for the Seven Network for over 30 years in my 2 different stints, and I feel very fortunate to have done so. Obviously in media, there have rightly been lots of discussions around culture in recent years. I can only speak from my personal experience. I am definitely someone who has always raised issues with my bosses when I felt like something wasn't right. I've raised issues I've raised issues on behalf of many others who maybe don't feel as secure or as confident as I do to bring it up. And whilst I realise I'm one of the rare few these days who has a network contract, I don't abuse the position that I have. I've always rocked the boat when I feel like I've seen average behaviour going on around me. And I think as a result of being consistent with that from day one, I've always been seen and I've always been listened to. And to be honest, I've been able to help lots of positive changes happen within my reach because of that. I am incredibly grateful that telly has opened up opportunities that allow me to do some really meaningful things outside of TV. The platform has allowed me to do a lot of charity work over the years. I know that sounds incredibly cliched, but I work for a lot of different charities, and I have always throughout my career. I actually have an honorary doctorate in the letters AM after my name these days, partly because of that, which are lovely acknowledgements. Sometimes they make me giggle. I know when I was giving the occasional address when I got my honorary doctorate, I had to spend most of the session not looking at my mum, who was sitting in the audience bawling her eyes out. And I'm a sympathy crier, so if somebody cries, tears just well up in my eyes. I can't stop it. So afterwards I said, Mum, that was so cute, but why were you actually bawling? Why were you bawling your eyes out? And she said, oh, darling, I just knew at this point my little high school dropout was going to be okay. I was like, really? There's like nothing else that I've done that maybe you thought I was on the right path? And then I had to explain to her I wasn't actually a real doctor. I was just a doctor of letters, even if my husband did buy me a stethoscope for a bit of fun. I've been on the board of Events New South Wales, and for the past 10 and a half years I've been on the board of Beyond Blue. I'm currently their longest serving director. In fact, I finished my 3-by-3-year tenure the year before last, and I received a rather unexpected 2-year extension to my board duties. It's quite rare, as it's a very highly coveted board to be on. You look at our chairs alone, the founder, Jeff Kennett, a former Victorian Premier, Julia Gillard, our first female PM who's doing the most amazing things on a global scale post-politics, Sam Mostyn, our newly minted, incredibly compassionate and kind Governor-General. And then we've currently got the Honourable Linda DeSalle, who's a former family High Court judge, and she was the first female Governor of Victoria, a position that she held for 8 years. I can't tell you how privileged I am to be able to learn off that set of high achievers, and what a great experience it's actually been in my life. But I think the extension was largely due because of the work that I do with BU. And for those of you that don't know what BU is, it is the government's National Mental Health and Wellbeing Initiative in schools and early learning services across Australia. I chair the National Advisory Council for it, which I love doing. It is a council made up of some of the most brilliant brains, thinkers and leaders from a huge variety of industry with a whole range of different skill sets, along with representatives for every level of government in both education and health. We're currently in 73% of all schools across Australia and 1 out of 3 early learning services around the country, and we are making massive strides. We're achieving the things that we were hoping to achieve when we launched well before we thought we would. And the very lofty goal of BU is to have a mentally healthy generation of children who think of their mental health and wellbeing in the same way they would as their physical health. Not to be held back by hesitation, by fear of stigma, fear of being judged, and in actual fact know what to look out for within themselves or their peers or someone in their school community or even in their home communities, but also know then what steps to take. We also have a huge focus on educator wellbeing. It's a program that I'm, again, incredibly proud of, because for so many mental health conditions, early intervention, we know, is the key to recovery and is the key to not having those mental health conditions reach crisis point. And then recently, after 30 years of volunteering for the Humpty Dumpty Foundation, I actually, early last year, took over from Ray Martin as patron of Humpty Dumpty. And the Humpty Dumpty Foundation provides life-saving medical equipment for babies and children in 500 hospitals, medical centres and research facilities right across the country. To understand how crucial their work is, requests come directly from our frontline workers, and in the last 12 months, their requests for life-saving equipment has gone up 69%. Which is genuinely terrifying. So again, we work very closely with state and federal governments, and we actually fill a gap that they are unable to service. So like Beyond Blue, Humpty has become part of the fabric of our health system. So a lot of my last year away from TV has spent touring these hospitals and medical centres and research facilities, getting a real understanding of the very real challenges that our frontline workers are actually up against, and also getting a real grasp on where the greatest changes can be made. It is a huge amount of work that I've undertaken, but to be perfectly honest, it's the stuff that fulfills me, that makes me feel good about what I'm doing. And I'm really lucky that it has the full support, my passions have the full support of the Seven Network, who work incredibly closely with me to combine my schedule for better homes, for everything else that I'm doing with those charities, so they assist them in sharing accommodation and flight costs, and I think that that is actually extraordinary that the network does it. So that kind of brings you up to date with where I am in my life. If I reflect on the most important lessons that I've learned that have got me to where I am today, it would be these. Don't be afraid to ask questions and to challenge what you've been told. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, just make sure you learn from them. Don't be afraid to show that you are vulnerable. If you need help, ask, because if you don't ask, you don't get. Don't be afraid to fail. I am really not sure why we have this obsession with pretending that we're all going to be perfect all of the time, because to be perfectly honest, we aren't. To me, failure often means that you're one step closer to success. Don't be afraid to stand up for those around you. There might be repercussions for you every now and then, but it's worth it. But for those people who mightn't be as strong or as stubborn or as determined as you are, don't think you're better than anyone else around you, because at the end of the day, when you break us all down, we are all so unbelievably the same. Don't disrespect the person with even the smallest job, because that person with the smallest job or the person with the quietest demeanour around you can actually be the one that teaches you the most. They're often the ones that have actually just spent the majority of their life just observing and learning. Take the time to see and hear the people around you. In fact, none of us should underestimate the power of listening to someone, particularly without judgment. Don't be defined by your past. Consider instead that you're prepared for everything that you're taking on because of it. And be kind to everyone. One, because being kind doesn't actually cost you anything at all. But you never will know when you actually might need kindness directed back to you personally in your lives and your life journey. And if you want more from your staff during these budget-conscious times, well, I'll tell you what, acknowledge them and appreciate them, because they will work 1,000 times harder for you if you do. And I think finally, and I would say don't take yourself too seriously. And to explain this, I'm just going to share a really vacuous story. I worked on the horse racing for 15 years. I'd happily never work on another horse racing event ever again, but for 15 years, for a while there, it was fun. I'd say to my bosses it was my paid working holiday. I would talk to drunk celebrities and influencers about what they were wearing. I'm not somebody who's remotely interested in fashion. In television, everyone would know, it's quite unusual to have a 6 foot tall woman who's not a size 6. So up until about 10 years ago when I started working with my current stylist, most reactions from stylists to me were, oh my God, put her in a muumuu, be inspired by Grab a Granny Night on a Tuesday night at the RSL, or just put more on her, just put more on her. And because I don't care enough about fashion, I wasn't always the greatest to turn up to all of my fittings to care enough. So I would often turn up to the race days. And the reason why I was doing the stuff I was doing is I can think in 30-second increments in my brain from swimming. So I could talk for 28 seconds or I could talk for 1 minute 47, whatever they'd want, you could do it almost to the second. So I would often walk in the morning at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning and look at my outfit and just go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to go on air like that. Like 1 year doing live interviews, I looked like, I don't know, someone who was handing out beers at Oktoberfest. And all day down my earpiece, as I'd be chatting to people, they'd be going, oh, we'd like 6 pints. And if we could get, I don't know, some pancakes with maple syrup, go, Griggsy, that'd be great. So I spent the whole time trying not to laugh. So not being big on the fashion, 1 year I went into my room and saw this outfit that had a jacket, a singlet and a very long full skirt. But around the whole outfit were pom-poms. And apparently pom-poms were in this year. And I remember looking at it thinking, oh, that is bloody hideous. But can't complain. If I'm not going to turn up and spend the time going through the outfits, you've got to wear it. So I put this outfit on and I've been talking to you for half an hour, so I feel like we're friends. I wasn't wearing the appropriate underwear for a long skirt, ladies and gentlemen. And I started walking down to the marquee and I had my phone against my ear and I had a notepad under it and I was getting a bit of late mail and I was writing down some notes and there was a massive gust of wind. And I dropped my phone and I dropped everything and I turned around to Matt White, who was behind me. I said, oh my God, Matt, did you see that? My skirt, dead set, almost went over my head. He said, mate, I saw it all right. He said, you reckon it's bad from your point? He said, I'm walking behind you. He said, no one needs to see that. And I was like, oh, sorry, mate. So I picked up my stuff, put the phone back, put my little notepad underneath again, and I just started to write some little notes again, and then there was another massive gust of wind. And my skirt went over my hat that was big enough to, I swear to God, take pictures of Mars, and the back of my skirt came up at the same time, and my arms were stuck in here, and the bloody pom-poms. The pom-poms tied together. And I'm thinking, oh, sorry. And I turn around and like Maddie's on the ground, just roaring with laughter. So he was no good to me. So I did what any person could do in that moment. So I just backed myself up against a marquee and I just crab walked along until I felt a gust of wind and realised that I was at the doorway to a marquee. And Simone Warren was working on our coverage. She dived across the room and she undid the pom-poms. And I had this moment going, please, earth, swallow me up, swallow me up. And when that didn't happen, I turned around and I said, ladies and gentlemen, here is the rest of me. No offence, I hope I never see any of you again. And to be perfectly honest, I learned not one, but actually two things in that. One is always wear the biggest pair of undies I can buy, the ones that start underneath my arms and finish at my knees. But the second thing I learned is never lose the ability to laugh at yourself, because a really good belly laugh can make the darkest moment or the darkest day just fade into the distance instantly. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being such a great audience. Appreciate it.